Okay, it's Friday. Let's do this. By which I mean talk for a little bit and then read a chapter of a book. Uh, you know, as we do here. What's new? What's new with you? Distracted by fries. Yeah, that's one way to keep the puppy occupied. I want to be distracted by fries. Getting pretty full. 7 spots filled in. Which I guess isn't really that much. Were you sent here? Were you sent here for snacks? Yum, 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 yum. I'm kidding, I'm kidding. Here you go. Back to the fries. He's gonna be going back and forth now. Washing dishes and getting home from work. That's not right. Ready for the weekend? Sharkies? Variety of sharkies? Doing anything exciting? Right. That's Sunday. You had told me that. How long does it take to make pierogies? I'm guessing you've got a press, right? Remember when I was younger, my mom had like a red plastic sort of press thing. I saw an interesting one very recently. Just it was like a video clip of someone using one, but it was like, and I don't know if it was specifically for pierogies. I think it was actually more for like an like Chinese dumpling or something. But it was like it was a press, but it had like the dumpling shape on one side, and then on the other side was flat. So you'd put like your bit of dough or whatever there, and you'd press this way, and then that would make it into a little disc that you'd put on the other side, and you'd put the filling in, and you'd press that way to make the dumpling, and then back and forth kind of thing. puppy's going back and forth himself. They work best when you go to boil them if you freeze them first. Interesting. There are rice cake bits in this room and fries in the other room, so I expect he's going to be going back and forth a bit. I'm surprised he hasn't gone back already. So, when you're both ready, let me know and I'll get started. I'm not really at like 100% energy tonight, so I'm just going to read one chapter of our new Kingarian. It's a little weird, right? Won't be down for a bit. Won't be down to boogie. And by boogie, I mean read a chapter of a book. Those are equivalent, right? That's what people are talking about when they say they're down to boogie. What? At all. They mean read a book. Fairly sure. From Granville Island. That's what Farmhouse always means. I haven't been to Granville Island for a while. And by which I think I mean like 3 years, because I think that was like one of the last places that we went out to before the first sort of big lockdown happened, if I'm remembering correctly. I think we got some sake and went to the art shops and maybe that like dragon shop. But yeah, I think that's sort of... Ooh, donuts. Yeah, we should go there again once it's a nice day out. Excuse me, Mr. Chicken. Yeah, so I'm sure everybody remembers very clearly what happened in the previous chapters. Garion and friends returned the orb. Yeah, that's definitely there, and honestly, I think Granville Island has the most aggressive seagulls that I've encountered in BC. I was gonna say there and like Steveston, like Gary Point Park, but really it's not even really seagulls there. It's like other little birds, and they're not that aggressive. They're like a little pushy. They want you to give them food, and they'll like come up onto the picnic tables as soon as anyone leaves. But they don't take food like from people directly, I don't think. And I can't really think of anywhere else particularly that has seagulls as aggressive as Granville Island, especially like around that food court area that has the like little plaza outside where they do performances and stuff. I'm pretty sure that's like they've got signs up at a lot of the shops there saying like, watch out for seagulls. We're not going to give you free food if they steal it. That would be so disappointing. down to boogie. So, in chapter 11, which was 2 chapters ago, Garion had all kinds of weird dreams, and he had a talk with Leldoran, and a talk with Aunt Pole, and a talk with Silk, and a talk with the voice in his head. And then he went and went into the Hall of the Raven King with Erend, who finally found someone willing to take that rock off of him. Just the best day of his life. But not the best day of Sinedra's life, as she screamed, "Oh no," and ran out of the room. So Garion has been announced as King Belgarion, King of Riva and Overlord of the West. Ooh. Then Garion had someone he thinks is probably a servant following him around as he wandered around the citadel a little bit. And then he met up with Princess Sinedra, who read to him from the Accords of Omimbre, which, surprise, they're engaged. And she's upset because he outranks him. At least that's what she says. So Garion went and found Mr. Silk. But, oh yeah, right? Garion went and found Silk and Leldoran, asking if there was a way out of this. Silk was very hungover. If we hadn't already filled in head injury, I would say this one qualified. And then they snuck on down to the town a little bit and visited a friend of Silk's, Torgan the Glass Blower, who's had a lot of business making little bottles for perfumes for, I think Tolnidra is what he said. We also met his genius apprentice, Joran. No other, no G in there. Who gifted Aunt Pole through Garion a beautifully wrought little glass wren, which she adored. And then at the end of chapter 12, Garion was properly crowned. One issue that Garion's been having is basically any time he's in any kind of close proximity to the orb, it really messes with him. It doesn't seem to be like a hostile thing, it's quite the opposite, I think, but it makes it pretty tough for Garion to think, which, with it sitting above his actual throne, kind of seems like it could be a problem. I don't know, if I were Overlord of the West, I wouldn't want my head to become all muddled every time I sat on my throne. Of all places, that seems like the worst one. So, I'm probably just going to read one chapter tonight. So we'll keep it hopefully not too long tonight, and everyone can get to their weekends. So chapter 13, on Friday the 13th. Oh. How, I don't know, unlucky, I guess. It's kind of funny that lined up like that. Yeah. All right. King Belgarion sat somewhat disconsolately, I can hear it in my head, but I can't say it out loud. Disconsolately. I feel like it should be faster. Auspicious, I don't think is right because Friday the 13th is unlucky, and just the number 13 in general is unlucky. So I think auspicious is usually more positive. Disconsolately. I don't know, whatever. On his throne in the hall of the Revan King, listening to the endless, droning voice of Valgon, the Tolnedran ambassador. 13's usually unlucky. I don't know that, like, 13's one of those things where there's not a 13th floor on buildings because it's unlucky. It had not been an easy time for Garion. There were so many things he did not know how to do. For one thing, he was totally incapable of giving orders. Oh. For another, he discovered that he had absolutely no time to himself, and that he had not the faintest idea of how to dismiss the servants who continually hovered near him. He was followed wherever he went, and he had even given up trying to catch the overzealous bodyguard or valet or messenger who was always in the passageways behind him. His friends seemed uncomfortable in his presence, and they persisted in calling him Your Majesty, no matter how many times he asked them not to. He didn't feel any different, and his mirror told him that he didn't look any different, but everyone behaved as if he had changed somehow. The look of relief that passed over their faces each time he left injured him, and he retreated into a kind of protective shell, nursing his loneliness in silence. Aunt Pole stood continually at his side now, but there was a difference there as well. Before, he had always been an adjunct to her. I feel like I've got a clumsy tongue tonight. But now it was the other way around, and that seemed profoundly unnatural. The proposal, if your majesty will forgive my saying so, is most generous, Valgon observed, concluding his reading of the latest treaty offer by Ran Boroon. The Tolnedran ambassador was a sardonic man with an aquiline nose and an aristocratic bearing. He was a Honathite, a member of that family which had founded the empire, and from which 3 imperial dynasties had sprung, and he had a scarcely concealed contempt for all Alorns. Valgon was a continual thorn in Garion's side. Hardly a day passed that some new treaty or trade agreement did not arrive from the Emperor. Garion had quickly perceived that the Tolnedrans were desperately nervous about the fact that they did not have his signature on a single piece of parchment, and they were proceeding on the theory that if they kept shoving documents in front of a man, eventually he would sign something just to get them to leave him alone. Garion's counter-strategy was very simple. He refused to sign anything. It's exactly the same as the one they offered last week, Aunt Pole's voice observed in the silence of his mind. All they did was switch the clauses around and change a few words. Tell him no. Garion looked at the smug ambassador with something very close to active dislike. Okay, Ben. There you go. Something very close to active dislike. Totally out of the question, he replied shortly. Valgon began to protest, but Garion cut him short. It's identical to last week's proposal, Valgon, and we both know it. The answer was no then, and it's still no. I will not give Tolnedra preferred status in trade with Riva. I will not agree to ask Ranboroon's permission before I sign any agreement with any other nation, and I most certainly will not agree to any modification of the terms of the Accords of Vomimbre. Please ask Ranboroon not to pester me anymore until he's ready to talk sense. Your Majesty, Valgon sounded shocked. One does not speak so to the Emperor of Tolnedra. Well, he is a little tired of this. Apparently this has been going on for at least a week, possibly longer. I'll speak any way I please, Garion told him. You have our permission to leave. Your Majesty, you're dismissed, Valgon. Garion cut him off. Snappy. The ambassador drew himself up, bowed coldly, and stalked from the hall. Yeah, maybe that's it. What are you doing back there? Not bad, King Anheg drawled from the partially concealed embrasure where he and the other kings generally gathered. The presence of these royal onlookers made Garion perpetually uneasy. He knew they were watching his every move, judging, evaluating his decisions, his manner, his words. He knew he was bound to make mistakes during these first few months, and he'd have greatly preferred to make them without an audience. But how could he tell a group of sovereign kings that he would prefer not to be the absolute center of their attention? A trifle blunt, though, wouldn't you say? King Fulrak suggested. He'll learn to be more diplomatic in time, King Rodar predicted. I expect that Ranboroon will find this directness refreshing, just as soon as he recovers from the fit of apoplexy that our Belgarian's reply is going to give him. The assembled kings and nobles all laughed at King Rodar's sally, and Garion tried without success to keep from blushing. Do they have to do that? He whispered furiously to Aunt Pole. Every time I so much as hiccup, I get all this commentary. Don't be surly, dear, she replied calmly. It was a trifle impolite, though. Are you really sure you want to take that tone with your future father-in-law? That was something of which Garion most definitely did not wish to be reminded. The Princess Senedra had still not forgiven him for his sudden elevation, and Garion was having grave doubts about the whole notion of marrying her. Much as he liked her, and he did like her, he regretfully concluded that Senedra would not make him a good wife. She was clever and spoiled, and she had a streak of stubbornness in her nature as wide as an ox cart. Garion was fairly certain that she would take a perverse delight in making his life as miserable as she possibly could. As he sat on his throne listening to the jocular comments of the Alorn kings, he began to wish that he had never heard of the orb. How dare he? As always, the thought of the jewel made him glance up to where it glowed on the pommel of the massive sword hanging above the throne. There was something so irritatingly smug about the way it glowed each time he sat on the throne. It always seemed to be congratulating itself, as if he, Belgarian of Riva, were somehow its own private creation. Garion did not understand the orb. There was an awareness about it. He knew that. His mind had tentatively touched that awareness, and then had carefully retreated. Garion had been touched on occasion by the minds of gods, but the consciousness of the orb was altogether different. Imagine that. Imagine encountering something and being like, oh yes, this is very different from a god. I know enough about gods to know that. I know enough about the minds of gods because I've encountered so many of them. There was a power in it he could not even begin to comprehend. More than that, its attachment to him seemed quite irrational. Garion... Wait, the ones that are like, those doors? Garion knew himself, and he was painfully aware that he was not that lovable. But each time he came near it, it would begin to glow insufferably, and his mind would fill with that strange, soaring song he had first heard in Ktuchik's turret. The song of the orb was a kind of compelling invitation. Garion knew that if he should take it up, its will would join with his, and there would be nothing that between them they could not do. Torak had raised the orb, and had cracked the world with it. Garion knew that if he chose, he could raise the orb and mend that crack. More alarming was the fact that as soon as the notion occurred to him, the orb began to provide him with precise instructions on how to go about it. "Pay attention, Garion," Aunt Pole's voice said to him. The business of that morning, however, was very nearly completed. There were a few other petitions, and a peculiar note of congratulation that had arrived that morning from Nyissa. The tone of the note was tentatively conciliatory, and it appeared over the signature of Sadi the eunuch. Garion decided that he wanted to think things through rather carefully before he drafted a reply. The memory of what had happened in Salmistra's throne room still bothered him, and he was not entirely sure he wanted to normalize relations with the snake people just yet. Then, since there was no further court business, he excused himself and left the hall. His ermine-trimmed robe was very hot, and the crown was beginning to give him a headache. He most definitely wanted to return to his apartment and change clothes. The guards at the side door to the hall bowed respectfully as he passed them and drew up into formation to accompany him. "I'm not really going any place," Garion told the sergeant in charge. "Just back to my rooms, and I know the way. Why don't you and your men go have some lunch?" "Your Majesty is very kind," the sergeant replied. "Will you need us later?" "I'm not sure. I'll send somebody to let you know." The sergeant bowed again, and Garion went on along the dimly lighted corridor. He had found this passageway about 2 days after his coronation, It was relatively unused, and it was the most direct route from the royal apartment to the throne room. Garion liked it because he could follow it to and from the great hall with a minimum of pomp and ceremony. There were only a few doors, and the candles on the walls were spaced far enough apart to keep the light subdued. The dimness seemed comforting for some reason, almost as if it restored, in some measure, his anonymity. He walked along, lost in thought. There were so many things to worry about. The impending war between the West and the Angarak kingdoms was uppermost in his mind. He, as overlord of the West, would be expected to lead the West, and Kal Torak, awakened from his slumber, would come against him with the multitudes of Angarak. How could he possibly face so terrible an adversary? The very name of Torak chilled him, and what did he know about armies and battles? Inevitably, he would blunder, and Torak would smash all the forces of the West with one mailed fist. Not even sorcery could help him. His own power was still too untried to risk a confrontation with Torak. Aunt Pole would do her best to aid him, of course, but without Belgarath, they had little hope of success. And Belgarath had still not given any indication that his collapse had not permanently impaired his abilities. Garion did not want to think about that anymore, but his other problems were nearly as bad. Very soon he was going to have to come to grips with Sinedra's adamant refusal to make peace. Yeah, that's almost as bad as Torak coming to kill everybody in the West. Very nearly as close. It's this far off. Oh boy, here we go. If only she would be, if she would only be reasonable. It's a good thing he didn't say that out loud. Garion was sure that the marginal difference in their rank would not make all that much difference. He liked Sinedra. He was even prepared to admit that his feelings for her went quite a bit deeper than that. Oh. She could, usually when she wanted something, be absolutely adorable. If they could just get past this one minor problem, things might turn out rather well. That possibility brightened his thoughts considerably. Musing about it, he continued on down the corridor. He had gone only a few more yards when he heard that furtive step behind him again. He sighed, wishing that his ever-present attendant would find some other amusement. Then he shrugged, and, deep in thought about the Nissen question, he continued on along the corridor. The warning was quite sharp and came at the last instant. "Look out!" the voice in his mind barked at him. Woof. Not knowing exactly why, not even actually thinking about it, Garion reacted instantly, diving headlong to the floor. His crown went rolling as, with a great shower of sparks, a thrown dagger clashed into the stone wall and went bouncing and skittering along the flagstones. Garion swore, rolled quickly, and came to his feet with his own dagger in his hand. Outraged and infuriated by this sudden attack, he ran back along the corridor, his ermine-trimmed robe flapping and tangling cumbersomely around his legs. He caught only one or two momentary glimpses of his gray-cloaked attacker as he ran after the knife-thrower. The assassin dodged into a recessed doorway some yards down the corridor. And Garion heard a heavy door slam behind the fleeing man. When he reached the door and wrenched it open, his dagger still in his fist, he found only another long, dim passageway. There was no one in sight. His hands were shaking, but it was more from anger than from fright. He briefly considered calling the guards, but almost immediately dismissed that idea. To continue following the assailant was, the more he thought about it, even more unwise. He had no weapon but his dagger, and the possibility of meeting someone armed with a sword occurred to him. There might even be more than one involved in this business, and these dimly lighted and deserted corridors were most certainly not a good place for confrontations. As he started to close the door, something caught his eye. A small scrap of gray wool lay on the floor just at the edge of the doorframe. Garion bent, picked it up, and carried it over to one of the candles hanging along the wall. The bit of wool was no more than 2 fingers wide, and seemed to have been torn from the corner of a gray Revan cloak. In his haste to escape, the assassin had, Garion surmised, inadvertently slammed the door on his own cape, and then had ripped off this fragment in his flight. Garion's eyes narrowed, and he turned and hurried back up the corridor, stooping once again to retrieve his crown, and again to pick up his assailant's dagger. He looked around once. The hallway was empty and somehow threatening. If the unknown knife-thrower were to return with 3 or 4 companions, things could turn unpleasant. Quick thinking, Sharkies. All things considered, it might be best to get back to his own apartments as quickly as possible, and to lock his door. Since there was no one around to witness any lack of dignity, Garion lifted the skirts of his royal robe and bolted like a rabbit for safety. He reached his own door, jerked it open, and jumped inside, closing and locking it behind him. He stood with his ear against the door, listening for any sounds of pursuit. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty?" Garion almost jumped out of his skin. He whirled to confront his valet, whose eyes widened as he saw the daggers in the king's hands. Nothing," he replied quickly, trying to cover his confusion. "Help me out of this thing." He struggled with the fastenings of his robe. His hands seemed to be full of daggers and crowns. I really hope this valet isn't the rumor-starting sort. I've heard of kings like this. With a negligent flip, he tossed his crown into a nearby chair. Daggers and Crowns sounds like the name of like a board game or something. Maybe an RPG system. With a negligent flip, he tossed his crown into a nearby chair, sheathed his own dagger, and then carefully laid the other knife and the scrap of wool on the polished table. The valet helped him to remove the robe and then carefully folded it over his arm. Would Your Majesty like to have me get rid of these for you?" he asked, looking a bit distastefully at the dagger and the bit of wool on the table. "No," Garion told him firmly. Then a thought occurred to him. "Do you know where my sword is?" he asked. "Your Majesty's sword hangs in the throne room," the valet replied. Right at this particular moment, I cannot imagine this valet's opinion of Garion is very high. "Not that one," Garion said. "The other one, the one I was wearing when I first came here." "I suppose I could find it," the valet answered a bit dubiously. "Do that," Garion said. I think I'd like to have it where I can get my hands on it. And please see if you can find Leldoran of Wildantor for me. I need to talk to him. At once, Your Majesty. The valet bowed and quietly left the room. Not the magic sword, the regular one. I thought I left that one in the fireplace. Garion took up the dagger and the scrap of cloth and examined both rather closely. The dagger was just a commonplace knife, heavy, sturdily made, and with a wire-bound hilt. Like me a good wire-bound hilt. It bore no ornaments or identifying marks of any kind. Its tip was slightly bent, the result of its contact with the stone wall. Whoever had thrown it had thrown very hard. Garion developed a definitely uncomfortable sensation between his shoulder blades. The dagger would probably not be very useful. There were undoubtedly 100 like it in the citadel. The wool scrap, on the other hand, might prove to be very valuable. Somewhere in this fortress there was a man with the corner of his cloak torn off. The torn cloak and this little piece of cloth would very likely match rather closely. About half an hour later, Leldoran arrived. "You sent for me, Garion?" he asked. "Sit down, Leldoran," Garion told his friend, then pointedly waited until the valet left the room. "I think I've got a little bit of a problem," he said then, sprawling deeper in the chair by the table. "I wondered if I might ask your help." "You know you don't have to ask, Garion," the earnest young Asturian told him. "This has to be just between the two of us," Garion cautioned. "I don't want anyone else to know." "My word of honor on it," Leldoran replied instantly. Garion slid the dagger across the table to his friend. "A little while ago, when I was on my way back here, somebody threw this at me." Leldoran gasped, and his eyes went wide. "Treason!" he gasped. He gasped twice in that sentence. Depending on how you read it, I guess. "Either that or something personal," Garion replied. "I don't know what it's all about." "You must alert your guards," Leldoran declared, jumping to his feet. "Yep." "No," Garion answered firmly. "If I do that, they'll lock me up entirely. I don't have very much freedom left at all, and I don't want to lose it." "Did you see him at all?" Leldoran asked, sitting down again and examining the dagger. "Just his back. He was wearing one of those gray cloaks." "All ravens wear gray cloaks, Garion." "We do have something to work with, though." Garion took the scrap of wool out from under his tunic. After he threw the knife, he ran through a door and slammed it shut behind him. He caught his cloak in the door, and this got ripped off. Leldoran examined the bit of cloth. "It looks like a corner," he noted. It's always good to start a puzzle from the corners, the corner bits. "That's what I think, too," Garion agreed. "If we both keep our eyes open, we might just happen to see somebody with the corner of his cloak missing. Then, if we can get our hands on his cloak, we might be able to see if this piece matches." Leldoran nodded his agreement, his face hardening. "When we find him, though, I want to deal with him. A king isn't supposed to become personally involved in that sort of thing." "I might decide to suspend the rules," Garion said, grimly,
I don't like having knives thrown at me. But let's find out who it is first. I'll start at once, Leldoran said, rising quickly. I'll examine every corner of every cloak in Riva if I have to. We'll find this traitor, Garion. I promise you.
Agreed. Yeah, that would have been my thought as well. He's been going to Silk with a lot of his problems recently. How do I get out of this thing with Sinedra? How do I get to know the people of my kingdom? Where are the baths? Maybe he just didn't feel like, bothering Silk with yet another little problem. Torak invading, problem with Sinedra, assassin throwing knives at him. Where are the baths? They're all very close on the scale. Most likely, we haven't really... Garion, since being crowned, Garion hasn't really interacted with many of his friends. And we haven't really... it's an interesting situation, isn't it? Because Garion knows that his friend Silk is also a spy and a prince of Drasnia, who is an allied kingdom. Technically, Garion's overlord of the West, so I think he's kind of in line, sort of in charge of Silk, depending on how you look at things. But I suppose Garion couldn't 100% be certain that anything he tells to Silk isn't going to make its way to Rodar. If Garion's even thinking that deeply, he might not be. Leldoran runs anyone just a little bit. Runs them through a small amount. All right. Garion felt better after that, but it was still a wary young king who, in the company of a detachment of guards, went late that afternoon to the private apartments of the Revan warder. He looked about constantly as he walked, and his hand was never far from the hilt of the sword at his waist. He found Brand seated before a large harp. The warder's big hands seemed to caress the strings of the instrument, bringing forth a plaintively rippling melody. The big, grim man's face was soft and reflective as he played, and Garion found that the music was even more beautiful because it was so unexpected. That's two bards on one page. Bard man. The Revan Bard. Literally, he's both grim and sitting at a harp. I got a double whammy. You play very well, my lord, he said respectfully as the last notes of the song lingered in the strings. I play often, your majesty, Brand replied. Sometimes as I play, I can even forget. Wow. This got heavy. Sometimes as I play, I can even forget that my wife is no longer with me. Way to bring down the mood. He rose from the chair in front of the harp and squared his shoulders, all softness going out of his face. How may I serve you, King Belgarion? Garion cleared his throat a trifle nervously. I'm probably not going to say this very well, he admitted, but please take it the way I mean it and not the way it might come out. Certainly, your majesty. I've been there. I've definitely had times where I've had to say something similar to that, where it's like, I know I'm gonna say this in a way where it's gonna come out sounding bad, and I don't mean it that way. I didn't ask for all this, you know. Garion began with a vague gesture that took in the entire citadel. The crown, I mean, and being king. All of it. I was really pretty happy the way I was. Yes, your majesty. What I'm trying to get at is, well, you were the ruler here in Riva until I came along. Brand nodded soberly. I didn't really want to be king, Garion rushed on, and I certainly didn't want to push you out of your position. Brand. Come on. How am I supposed to read with this going on? Brand looked at him, and then he slowly smiled. I'd wondered why you seemed so uneasy whenever I came into the room, your majesty. Is that what's been making you uncomfortable? Mutely, Garion nodded. You don't really know us yet, Belgarion, Brand told him. You've only been here for a little more than a month. We're a peculiar sort of people. For over 3,000 years we've been protecting the orb, ever since Iron Grip came to this island. That's why we exist. And I think that one of the things we've lost along the way is that sense of self other men seem to feel is so important. Do you know why I'm called Brand? I never really thought about it, Garion admitted. I do have another name, of course, Brand said, but I'm not supposed ever to mention it. Each warder has been called Brand so that there could never be any sense of personal glory in the office. We serve the orb. That's our only purpose. To be quite honest with you, I'm really rather glad you came when you did. It was getting close to the time when I was supposed to choose my successor. With the help of the orb, of course. But I didn't have the faintest idea who I was supposed to choose. Your arrival has relieved me of that task. It's an interesting, I've seen a similar sort of idea before, but this is an interesting take on it. Every warder is called Brand, and we're not even allowed to mention whatever name we had previously. I appreciate that he's not, Brand the 28th or anything like that, too. Pete Bog. We can be friends, then? I think we already are, Belgarion, Brand replied gravely. We both serve the same master, and that always brings men closer together. Always. I'm missing a pair of end quotation marks on that one. Garion hesitated. Am I doing all right? He blurted. Brand considered that. Some of the things you've done weren't exactly the way I might have done them, but that's to be expected. Rodar and Anheg don't always do things the same way either. Each of us has his own particular manner. They make fun of me, don't they? Anheg, Rodar, and the others. I hear all the clever remarks every time I make a decision. I wouldn't worry too much about that, Belgarion. They're Alorns, and Alorns don't take kings very seriously. They make fun of each other too, you know. You could almost say that as long as they're joking, everything is all right. If they suddenly become very serious and formal, then you'll know that you're in trouble.
I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way, Garion admitted. You'll get used to it in time, Brand assured him. Now that you've taken my job, I can almost forget that my wife's no longer with me. Garion felt much better after his conversation with Brand. That transition was not seamless. Okay. In the company of his guards, he started back toward the royal apartments. But partway there, he changed his mind and went looking for Aunt Pole instead. When he entered her rooms, his cousin Adara was sitting quietly with her, watching as Aunt Pole carefully mended one of Garion's old tunics. The girl rose and curtsied formally. Min. Please, Adara, he said in a pained voice. Don't do that when we're alone. I see enough of it out there. He gestured in the direction of the more public parts of the building. Whatever your majesty wishes, she replied. And don't call me that. I'm still just Garion. She looked gravely at him with her calm, beautiful eyes. No, cousin, she disagreed. You'll never be just Garion any more. He sighed as the truth of that struck his heart. If you'll excuse me, she said then, I must go attend to Queen Silar. She's a bit unwell, and she says it comforts her to have me near. It comforts all of us when you're near, Garion told her without even thinking about it. Smooth. She smiled at him fondly. There might be some hope for him after all, Aunt Pole observed, her needle busy. Adara looked at Garion. He's never really been that bad, Lady Polgara, she said. She inclined her head toward them both and quietly left the room. Garion wandered around for a few moments, and then flung himself into a chair. A great deal had happened that day, and he felt suddenly at odds with the whole world. Aunt Pole continued to sew. Why are you doing that? Garion demanded finally. I'll never wear that old thing again. It needs fixing, dear, she told him placidly. There are 100 people around who could do it for you. I prefer to do it myself. Put it down and talk to me. She set the tunic aside and looked at him inquiringly. And what did your majesty wish to discuss? She inquired. Aunt Pole! Garion's voice was stricken. Not you too! Don't give orders then, dear, she recommended, picking up the tunic again. Garion watched her at her sewing for a few moments, not really knowing what to say. A strange thought occurred to him. Why are you doing that, Aunt Pole? He asked, really curious this time. Probably nobody'll ever use it again, so you're just wasting time on it. It's my time, dear, she reminded him. She looked up from her sewing, her eyes unreadable. Then, without explanation, she held up the tunic with one hand and ran the forefinger of her other hand carefully up the rip. Garion felt a very light surge, and the sound was only a whisper. The rip mended itself before his eyes, rewoven as if it had never existed. Now you can see how completely useless mending it really is, she told him. That's perfect. Why do you do it then? Because I like to sew, dear, she replied. With a sharp little jerk, she ripped the tunic again. Then she picked up her needle and patiently began repairing the rip. Sewing keeps the hands and eyes busy, but leaves the mind free for other things. It's very relaxing. Sometimes you're awfully complicated, Aunt Pole. Yes, dear, I know. Geryon paced about for a bit, then suddenly knelt beside her chair and, pushing her sewing aside, he put his head into her lap. Oh, Aunt Pole, he said, very close to tears. What's the matter, dear? She asked, carefully smoothing his hair. I'm so lonely. Is that all? He lifted his head and stared at her incredulously. He had not expected that. Everyone's lonely, dear, she explained, drawing him close to her. We touch other people only briefly, then we're alone again. You'll get used to it in time. There's the thousands of years old angst coming out, or apathy. Nobody will talk to me now, not the way they did before. They're always bowing and saying, Your Majesty, to me. You are the king, after all, she replied. But I don't want to be. That's too bad. It's the destiny of your family, so there's not a thing you can do about it. Did anybody ever tell you about Prince Garrod? I'm assuming it's Garrod and not Jared. I've never seen Jared spelled G-A-R-E-D. And I would think it's probably related, like, Garath, Garion, Garrod. I don't think so. Who was he? He was the only survivor when the Nisanen assassins killed King Gorak and his family. He escaped by throwing himself into the sea. How old was he? 6. He was a very brave child. Everyone thought that he had drowned and that his body had been washed out to sea. Your grandfather and I encouraged that belief. For 1,300 years we've hidden Prince Garrod's descendants. For generations they've lived out their lives in quiet obscurity for the single purpose of bringing you to the throne. And now you say that you don't want to be king? I don't know any of those people, he said sullenly. He knew he was behaving badly, but he couldn't seem to help himself. Would it help if you did know them? Some of them, anyway. The question baffled him. Perhaps it might, she decided. She laid her sewing aside and stood up, drawing him to his feet. Come with me, she told him, and led him to the tall window that looked out over the city below. There was a small balcony outside. In one corner, where a rain gutter had cracked, there had built up during the fall and winter a sheet of shiny black ice, curving down over the railing and spreading out on the balcony floor. Aunt Pole unlatched the window and swung it open, admitting a blast of icy air that made the candles dance. Look directly into the ice, Geryon, she told him, pointing at the glittering blackness. Look deep into it. He did as she told him and felt the force of her mind at work. Something was in the ice, shapeless at first, but emerging slowly and becoming more and more visible. It was, he saw finally, the figure of a pale blonde woman, quite lovely and with a warm smile on her lips. She seemed young, and her eyes were directly on Geryon's face. My baby, a voice seemed to whisper to him. My little Geryon. Geryon began to tremble violently. Mother? He gasped. So tall now, the whisper continued. Almost a man. And already a king, Ildera, Aunt Pole told the phantom in a gentle voice. Then he was the chosen one, the ghost of Garion's mother exulted. I knew it. I could feel it when I carried him under my heart. A second shape had begun to appear beside the first. It was a tall young man with dark hair, but a strangely familiar face. Garion clearly saw its resemblance to his own. Hail, Belgarion, my son, the second shape said to him. Father, Garion replied, not knowing what else to say. Our blessings, Garion, the second ghost said as the two figures started to fade. I avenged you, father, Garion called after them. It seemed important that they know that. He was never sure, however, if they had heard him. Aunt Pole was leaning against the window frame with a look of exhaustion on her face. Are you all right? Garion asked her, concerned. It's a very difficult thing to do, dear, she told him, passing a weary hand over her face. But there was yet another flicker within the depths of the ice, and the familiar shape of the blue wolf appeared. The one who had joined Belgarath in the fight with Groll the Eldrak in the mountains of Ulgo. The wolf sat looking at them for a moment, then flickered briefly into the shape of a snowy owl, and finally became a tawny-haired woman with golden eyes. Her face was so like Aunt Pole's that Garion could not help glancing quickly back and forth to compare them. You left it open, Polgara, the golden-eyed woman said gently. Her voice was as warm and soft as a summer evening. Yes, mother, Aunt Pole replied. I'll close it in a moment. It's all right, Polgara, the wolf woman told her daughter. It gave me the chance to meet him. She looked directly into Garion's face. A touch or two is still there, she observed. A bit about the eyes, and in the shape of the jaw. Does he know? Not everything, mother, Aunt Pole answered. Perhaps it's as well, Poledra noted. Once again, another figure emerged out of the dark depths of the ice. The second woman had hair like sunlight, and her face was even more like Aunt Pole's than Poledra's. Polgara, my sister, my dear sister, she said. Beldaran, Aunt Pole responded in a voice overwhelmed with love. And Belgarion, Garion's ultimate grandmother said. I feel like it should be penultimate, shouldn't it? I mean, Poledra's right there. The final flower of my love and Riva's. Our blessings also, Belgarion, Poledra declared. Farewell for now, but know that we love thee. And then the two were gone. Does that help? Aunt Pole asked him, her voice deep with emotion and her eyes filled with tears. Garion was too stunned by what he had just seen and heard to answer. Dumbly he nodded. I'm glad the effort wasn't wasted then, she said. Please close the window, dear. It's letting the winter in. Ooh. And that's the end of chapter 13, which was a bit longer than I thought it might be. A lot happened there. We had Garion doing some kinging and then some avoiding being assassinated. And then some talking with a variety of people, meeting some ghosts. And I'm hungry. Right, Ben?
You were right that there would be ghosts, just not murder ghosts. Yeah. Had both the words weary and wary in that chapter. Pottermouse's favorite duo. And we had Lil Doran almost over gasping. I always take care to clearly enunciate wary anytime it comes up. Both of them, really. Oh, look at that pup. Oh, well, I am going to go eat some chicken wings, I think. I'm gonna eat some chicken wings, and then I'm probably gonna go to bed not much longer not long after that. I don't think I'm likely to be doing anything specific tomorrow, but Sunday, assuming that I'm in good health, I'll be helping our roommate move out. It's gonna be interesting. He's excited about his new place. All right. Have a good weekend. I hope you enjoy your pierogies and not at all cabbage casserole, whatever it was called. Cabbage non-rolls. Hope it's good. Tell me about it next Wednesday. Merry belated Ukrainian Christmas. Lazy halopsy. Oh. All right. Thanks for joining me. See you on Wednesday. Bye.